so on the basis of humanitarian principles that are guided by international humanitarian law. Those principles, the first one is humanity, but the other three are also very important. We must bring our assistance in complete neutrality. We must do so independently. And the last, we must do so impartially, which means to deliver assistance only along the criteria of need, wherever it is needed most. And we bring that assistance largely in areas of conflict, in areas of epidemic, and in areas of natural disasters. Natural disasters just like the Typhoon Haiyan that just struck the Philippines. In several minutes, we saw villages, whole lives washed away. No sooner had the surge of the storm finished than came forth a surge of empathy and a surge of human empathy and a human construct which reached out to help neighbors. Neighbors dug each other from the rubble. Doctors who were nearby went as far as the roads can take them to bring their assistance where it was needed most. Everyday citizens bought food and brought it to neighbors and to others who were in need. At the same time, humanitarian organizations such as ours also went into action. And citizens like yourselves generated great empathy in order to back that work. At Doctors Without Borders, we now have over 600 staff in the field. We're running 4 hospitals and countless mobile clinics bringing our assistance to those in need. And I've often thought that in conflict strikes families just like an earthquake. And perhaps now I'll have to change that to typhoon. Because what we see is instead of a wave and winds that blow away people's houses and leave them devastated, in Syria what we are seeing is it's mortars that crash through the roofs, that shake the walls, bringing the houses down around people and their lives with them. They often escape only with the clothes on their back, and they escape many times with great injuries trying to seek life-saving care. But even that care is often denied them. As they seek to flee, they are targeted, and they are unable to find medical care, protection, or assistance. A crisis that has now taken over 110,000 lives and created displacements of over 6 million people. Yet somehow the world is strangely silent. We don't see the outpouring of empathy we saw in Haiyan. And yet the needs are strikingly similar, the basic building blocks of life: water, food, shelter, medical care. And I struggled with that question. Why is it that we have such different empathies to what are largely the same results that affect civilians through no fault of their own? So why this lack of empathy? Why the underwhelming support for Syria? I thought one of the main blockages might be the scale. We might not know where to begin when we hear these numbers of 2 million people that have sought refuge, 4 million people displaced, 1 million houses destroyed, a health system collapsed, and polio and measles becoming resurgent and affecting the young. When we hear that the hospitals have been bombed, 40 to 60% of the hospitals are out of service. The doctors have been targeted and so many fled. Where to begin? So maybe that is something that hurts us when we're trying to develop our empathy for this disaster that the UN has called the greatest refugee crisis of the century. And then I thought, well, it can't simply be that. After all, in the Hurricane Haiyan, the needs are also overwhelming. So maybe it's also the conflict picture itself, which is very complicated. When we hear talk of rebels, of infighting, of chemical weapons, I think it's hard for us to understand who are the good, who are the bad. How does the situation unfold, and what will be a good outcome? As we struggle to try to understand the conflict, perhaps we turn off our minds and we turn away. And yet, as I said earlier, the basic building blocks are the same: water, food, shelter, and medical care. And we know how to deliver these on the ground. And despite what we might hear with the challenges, it is possible, and we are doing so. When we look at Syria on the macro scale, there are a number of major challenges. I spoke of one a minute ago, the protecting challenge. Civilians are being targeted in this war in contravention of the Geneva Conventions, which dictate the rules of war. There's a huge aid imbalance. most of the assistance that goes into Syria has to go through Damascus. So the assistance brought by the UN, by the World Food Programme, by the Red Cross, all very valuable assistance. But it has to go in through where the government controls it. There's a large bureaucracy, so every time you try to take some aid somewhere, you have to do paperwork for several days, sometimes weeks. And then, at great risk to themselves, valiant volunteers of the Red Crescent bring that aid across front lines. 22 members of their teams have been shot and killed trying to do just that this year. And so much more aid needs to come across borders from the neighboring countries to try to reach the population centers where the need is greatest. We're even seeing blockades, the age-old art of the siege, where food, water, and medicine are being used to starve populations out, and both sides of the conflict are using this technique and this tactic, a tactic that simply must stop. Inside Syria, my organization, Doctors Without Borders, MSF, is running 6 surgery hospitals, maternity wards. We're caring for chronic disease. We're bringing vaccinations for the children. And we've brought in tons of fuel, of food, and of other supplies to try to help the population through last winter, and we'll do so again this winter. But we can't reach everywhere, and in fact, we don't have official permission to work via Damascus. So in the government-held areas and in the areas of dual control, we're helping 30 hospitals and another 60 health centers. We send medicines, we send surgery equipment, and we bring the health personnel out and train them, because there's a shortage now of medical personnel, since medical personnel have been targeted. But how to make this a little more real? I've been to Syria 2 times in this past year and to the surrounding countries, and saw firsthand that aid can be delivered despite the challenges, and that it is possible. And I thought I'd share with you 2 small stories that show the difference in the lives of those who have already been affected and have had to flee their homes. In one area along the border, I went to what is called a transit camp on my first visit. There were 16,000 souls in that small tented camp along the border. The conditions were quite atrocious, and I was very fearful that there would be outbreaks of disease in the summertime. Upon my return, I was very pleased to see that our teams had built a whole new water system, including chlorination, as well as latrines and showers, and handed all that over to a local organization that was now running it effectively. And when I was walking through the camp, I noticed there was so many empty tents, and I thought first maybe that was a positive sign. Maybe people had been able to go home. When I sat down in one of the tents and started talking with the inhabitants, I learned that that was an error in my way. In fact, what had happened is those who had money, those who had passports, had been able to buy their way into the neighboring country. The others, the remainder, had no place to go. They couldn't seek refugee status outside. They also couldn't return to their homes because the areas where they lived were still heavily in conflict. And these people were depending on aid assistance, which was diminishing. The food rations had been cut, and they now had 2 great fears. The first was of the planes that flew overhead. Every once in a while, they would come in, they would never bomb, but every once in a while, they would shoot a few tents and bring a few more souls out of the camp. The others who were wounded would be treated at our hospitals. And we'd also enroll the people in a mental health program, the least we could do, to help them cope with this, because they were now becoming fearful every time there was a plane or a truck or any kind of a loud motorized sound. It was the most and the least that we could do. Their second fear was spending a second winter in these really disgusting, horrible conditions. They're living in a mud land with just a canvas tent between them and the bullets and them in the cold. And we're already seeing our hospital wards filling up with all of the seasonal infections which come along with the damp and the cold. The second story is a slightly more positive one. I was up on the border of Iraq, and I witnessed there a border that had been closed for a long, long time, for many months, and people were amassing on the other side. And in a few short days, 10 days in fact, 50,000 Syrians managed to escape into Iraq. And we were there. I was overlooking the valley where our hospital tent was, and you could see the Syrians coming across the desert. They had to walk these great distances across the desert in order to change from one country to the other. And as they came closer, I began to notice that most of them had only a small plastic bag with them, or one small roll-out suitcase for a whole family of 6. By the time they got up to our clinic, many were emaciated, others had palpitations, heart problems, and the first thing they did was come into our clinic before even going to register with the UN. And I began speaking with these people, and I asked them, why is it that you brought such small amount of things with you? And they said they feared so much that they would be turned back, that they would be detained, they'd be imprisoned for trying to flee. And so they had to make it look like that they weren't leaving at all and to tell no one that they were in flight. I remember thinking how courageous these people were. They had survived 2.5 years of war, yet they were at wit's end. They could no longer feed their families. They could no longer see an end to the conflict. And yet, they fled to try to at least seek protection, depending on the generosity of the outside world to care for them tomorrow. And I'm very proud to say that our organization is running health care in Domise Camp, which is on that border, which has been welcoming and treating those people as they arrive.